So, this is one of the strangest, most uncomfortable, and yet utterly fascinating films I have ever watched. And it's also an incredibly important and influential addition to Sapphic cinema. This film not only contains the first graphic lesbian love scene to be shown in a piece of mainstream cinema, but one of the longest lesbian love scenes in film too. What a brag. So, there's something for everyone who is over the age of 18 to enjoy. For science. Hi guys, welcome to a video, and in today's video we're just going to be discussing the French-Belgian 1974 film Je Tu Il Elle. Once again, I am here apologising for my poor pronunciation. Je n'en parle français. If you're not familiar with this film, it's about a young woman who, following a lengthy self-imposed exile, ventures out into the world where she has two very different experiences of intimacy. Now, despite this film often being labelled as a lesbian film, like by me for deceit, trickery and algorithm purposes. Strictly speaking, it's not. Now, the director Chantal Akerman actually rejected any labels being placed on both herself and her work, as she saw film as, and I quote, a generative field of freedom from the boundaries of identity, and she intended Je Tu Il Elle to be a portrayal of human connection and desire, and it is exactly that. But at the same time, for the sake of clear communication, understanding. In terms of the sexuality aspect, this film depicts a bisexual experience. The main character, Julie, does have an encounter with a man. I mean, it's not explicit, you don't even see so much as a kiss between them, and the implications behind their encounter is up for interpretation. But even with all of that, due to the film's groundbreaking sapphic elements and its artistic influence, Je Tu Il Elle still makes up an important and interesting part of lesbian and sapphic cinematic history, and I'm excited to talk about it. So, things to know about Je Tu Il Elle. Firstly, Chantal Akerman not only directed the film, but she also co-wrote and starred in it too. The film was incredibly personal to Akerman, with parts of it reflecting experiences that she'd had in her real life. It was also made on a shoestring budget of what would be equivalent to €7,000 today, and the film was shot in just 6 days. Akerman was also rumoured to be a lesbian, although as discussed earlier, she didn't like labels, so this can't be 100% confirmed. But whatever her identity, she did have a female life partner, Sonia Vida Atherton, who deeply influenced her life and work. And interestingly, Claire Wotillon, the actress who plays Julie's ex-girlfriend in Je Tu Il Elle, was believed to be Akerman's real-life lover at the time. As mentioned earlier, the love scene between Julie and her ex-girlfriend in the film is the first ever graphic lesbian love scene in mainstream cinema, and also one of the longest lesbian love scenes in film, making Je Tu Il Elle a groundbreaking piece of work. And lastly, Akerman sadly struggled with depression and ended up taking her own life at the age of 65. Now, personally, I would describe Je Tu Il Elle as an artistic experience above anything else. The entire production is shot in black and white, and Akerman utilizes shadows, lighting, contrast, and different perspectives to create various moods and implications. I mean, the cinematography and arrangement of each scene in this film is beautiful, and each frame is akin to looking at a thoughtful piece of intimate photography. The film is also an unhurried and introspective production, and I think this kind of a film is fascinating to watch in the era of short-form social media content and immediacy, because its slow pace encourages the viewer to have patience with what they are being presented with and to form their own interpretations and therefore be involved in the film. Another unique element of Je Tu Il Elle is that the naked female body is not sexualized and it's not presented for the male gaze. Julie strips herself down and simply exists within her own body. Her nudity is not for the benefit of someone else, nor is it presented in a way which demands any specific reaction from the viewer. It's a very neutral portrayal of the female body, and this is something that was, and still is to a degree, rare to see in cinema. Interestingly enough, when I was watching this film, I was really reminded of Portrait of a Lady on Fire. And when I went to do my research, I actually discovered that Celine Sciamma had spoken in length about the impact that Akerman had on her work. And I know Sciamma was influenced by, other works from Akerman, not just Je Tu Il Elle. But if you watch Portrait of a Lady on Fire after watching Je Tu Il Elle, you can observe striking similarities and feel Ackerman's influence in the way that both films create space for introspection and for the viewer to sit within the moments being created, and as discussed earlier, develop their own interpretation of what's unfolding on screen. They are also both radically feminist pieces of work that capture the female gaze in a way that I haven't seen in any other films. So I think in some ways you could view Portrait of a Lady on Fire as a beautiful homage to Ackerman as an artist, and it makes me a bit emotional. Je Tu Il Elle is also a triptych, and for those who don't know, a triptych is something composed or presented in 3 parts or sections. And I wanted to discuss each section of the film individually because they are all interesting for different reasons. Now, in the first section of the film, it's implied that Julie is recovering from a breakup. Although we aren't given many details about this, and she spends her time lounging around in various positions, staring into nothingness and eating sugar out of a bag. And my interpretation of this section, and let me know your own interpretations down in the comments section below, because I love reading different perspectives about this film, is that primarily it's a portrayal of depression, or at least spells of depression, and I felt the lighting in this section often fading to black, and sometimes lingering there was a visual reflection of Julie's mental state. Julie also notes how people are passing by outside, going about their lives, and the cinematography and direction in this section place an emphasis on Julie's isolation and her stagnancy through silent, still drawn out shots of her remaining in one position, which is contrasted against the outside world that contains motion and noise. And the large glass doors that separate Julie from the outside world are symbolically interesting because they are representative of how she's mentally disconnected from it and how she's inside looking out, unable to participate, which is a reflection of Julie's alienation from society as someone who is both suffering from poor mental health and whose sexuality makes her an outsider or other. For example, when Julie hears the sounds of children outside, she stands near the glass doors and listens to the sounds whilst looking incredibly contemplative. And there are many ways to interpret this scene, but I perceived the noise of carefree, joyous children in stark contrast to the silent, pensive figure of Julie as a portrayal of her deep unhappiness and burdened state of mind. You could also interpret this as Julie feeling disconnected from motherhood, family, and heteronormative expectations, since children are strongly attached to those notions. And Julie's sense of profound loneliness and disconnection from society that this section of the film builds upon is a reflection of both what people struggling with their mental health and same-sex attracted people experience. And so Julie existing in such an isolated way, looking out at everyone else living their lives, could be commentary on or a reflection of either or both of those elements of her character. Another interesting aspect of this section of the film, as discussed earlier, is its portrayal of female nudity. Now, it's notable that Julie takes her clothes off after writing out her feelings on paper, and so because of this, I actually perceived her nudity as symbolic of her emotional vulnerability and bearing her soul. It's also notable that Julie seems comfortable and unconcerned with her naked body while she's by herself, but as soon as a male figure walks past her window and observes her, we see her putting her clothes back on, and after that, she then strips herself down once more to observe herself. And it's notable that Julie wasn't interested in observing her own body until other people did. And the fact that the observer is male, looking in at her through the window as though she's some sort of zoo attraction or display item, possibly also contains wider commentary on how men view and treat female bodies as an exhibition. And I interpreted the portrayal of female nudity in this section as a reflection of the way that women can truly only exist in their bodies in comfort when they are free from the observation of others, and how, when being observed, particularly by men, female bodies are turned into an exhibit, which results in a level of self-consciousness. I also think there's a meta element in this film where, through its artistic and technical choices, either inadvertently or purposefully makes commentary on the male-dominated film industry and how we're used to consuming women's bodies in cinema. Je Tu Il Elle is a film which makes commentary on film and highlights how women's experiences, bodies and selves are distorted through it. Another notable aspect of the first section is that Julie doesn't speak. We do hear her internal monologue, but she doesn't actually say anything out loud. And I interpreted this as a reflection of how both womanhood and poor mental health can be a silent experience. With womanhood, it's in the sense that women's voices have historically been, and still are to a degree, depending on circumstance, disregarded, diminished or silenced, making womanhood an internal experience. And with poor mental health, how suffering from it is also a very internal experience that a lot of people endure in silence. So yes, I think there's a multitude of symbolism and commentary in the first section of the film, and you could certainly deconstruct it in a much more meticulous way than I have to uncover even more. And what's fascinating about this first section of the film is that barely anything happens, and yet it says so much. Moving on to the second section of the film, where Julie leaves her cocoon, enters the outside world and ends up hitchhiking with a male truck driver. Firstly, one of the most notable aspects of this section of the film is that Julie's internal monologue is reduced to just a couple of lines. And if we compare this to the first section, where Julie expressed an abundance of thoughts, especially pertaining to herself, it conveys how when women step out of the domestic sphere into the male-dominated public sphere, their thoughts, opinions and feelings become diminished. Interestingly, the only significant amount of dialogue that takes place in this section is when the truck driver delivers a lengthy monologue about his sexuality to Julie. In fact, he speaks more than any other character in the entire film, and his lengthy dialogue also sits in stark contrast to the minuscule amount that the female characters have. And there's certainly commentary on how diminished female voices were and are compared to male ones in both society and cinema here, but alongside that, this section also very much highlights how unequal things become when men enter the picture. In some ways, this section portrays what we're used to seeing from the male-dominated film industry. For example, it heavily focuses on men and male sexuality, and the female character very much becomes a secondary figure who doesn't really have any thoughts outside of admiring the male character. And the fact that this section is placed in between the two other sections, which exclusively focus on female characters through a female gaze, creates a striking contrast. A lot of what the truck driver is saying is also incredibly explicit. He shares how he sexualizes his young daughter, how women crying turns him on, and how he cheats on his wife because their marriage became sexless after she got pregnant. And it's an unfiltered speech that reveals the depraved and taboo aspects of male sexuality. But the film doesn't seek to demonize the truck driver for it. It simply just lets him speak his truth and creates space for the viewer to interpret it how they will. However, that said, the positioning of the characters during this monologue does contain implications. For example, whilst the truck driver is talking, Julie is only partially in frame, facing towards the truck driver, who is the focus, and she stays completely mute throughout his monologue. This portrays how Julie is not a part of the conversation he is having about sex and sexuality, which further emphasizes how women's feelings are not a consideration in the truck driver's sexual desires and behavior. The truck driver also never stops to ask Julie a question or for her input at any point. It's all about his desires and projections, and that in itself contains quite overt commentary about the self-centered nature of male sexuality. It's also notable that all of Julie's interactions with the truck driver, a man, take place in the public sphere, which sits in contrast to the interactions between Julie and her ex-lover, a woman, which take place in the domestic sphere. And this reflects the open and public nature of heterosexual dynamics and the private and hidden nature of homosexual ones. As for the moment of intimate contact between Julie and the truck driver, I think this is an interesting area of discussion. Firstly, it's notable that in Julie's internal monologue, she does mention admiring the truck driver's physical features and wanting to kiss him. There's also what you could interpret as moments of chemistry and connection between them, both of which suggest an attraction. But Julie doesn't actually initiate the sexual contact. The truck driver places her hand there without asking or checking in with her. And whilst Julie doesn't take her hand away, she also doesn't give any indication that she actually wants to engage in something sexual. So the consent aspect is murky. And interestingly, we also don't actually see Julie in this scene, which suggests that this moment is not about her. The focus is solely on the truck driver, his pleasure, and what he desires. And this could be interpreted as either a reflection of Julie's sexuality and representative of how she's not mentally or emotionally present with men, or of the way in which women commonly experience male sexuality, with their wants, needs, and feelings not being the focus or even a consideration. The fact that Julie is not in frame for this scene sits in stark contrast to when she initiates intimacy with her ex-girlfriend, where not only is she in frame just as much as her ex-girlfriend, which, unlike with the truck driver, portrays an equality between the two, but there is space created for consent and connection. The intimate moment with the truck driver is also a fairly clinical act that's devoid of any tenderness or emotional connection, and is over rather quickly. And when we compare that to the lengthy entanglement of Julie and her ex-girlfriend, it suggests a lot about Julie's personal desires, and contains wider commentary about the differences between male and female sexuality, and heterosexual and lesbian intimacy. And this brings us on to the third and final section of the film, where Julie turns up at her ex-girlfriend's apartment. Now, interestingly, Julie shows signs of hesitation and nerves before entering the apartment, and she also falls to her knees, either intentionally or unintentionally, I couldn't tell, in front of her ex-girlfriend. But either way, I perceived all of this as visual clues to the depths of Julie's feelings for this woman, and to the power dynamic of their relationship. It suggests that out of the two, Julie is the more emotionally invested one, and that the ex-girlfriend holds all of the cards in their relationship. And this is underscored by the ex-girlfriend telling Julie that she doesn't want her to stay. All of this also creates some context for the first part of the film, where we see Julie struggling over a breakup, and the rejection she faces here from her one meaningful connection in a society in which she otherwise feels alienated explains a lot about her emotional and mental devastation that we see her display in the first section of the film. And there's actually a loop created between the last section of this film and the first, which we'll touch upon again in a bit. Interestingly, when Julie first goes to leave her ex's apartment, she ends up lingering by the exit, and there's a lot of unspoken tension before Julie tells her ex-girlfriend that she's hungry. And it's notable that in the next scene they end up sitting at a dining table, with Julie's ex-girlfriend providing Julie with food from the kitchen, an environment which represents both nourishment and femininity. And Julie's ex-girlfriend providing Julie with food and drink also has nurturing connotations, which complements the intersection of domesticity and femininity that the kitchen and the dining table represent. Of course, this is also symbolic of Julie's sexual hunger for women, especially since her eating and drinking is followed by her unbuttoning her ex-girlfriend's dress. Now, as for the famous love scene, I thought it was interesting that it's so explicit in contrast to the heterosexual encounter, which is merely implied instead of shown, and the fact that the film diminishes the heterosexual encounter and magnifies the homosexual one is one of its most radical aspects, especially for the time in which it was made, where heteronormativity in cinema was heavily prioritized. Another unique and interesting aspect of the love scene is, despite how explicit it is, it's not objectifying or shot in a way with the intent of arousing the viewer. And again, this was radical for the time in which the film was made, where both women and lesbianism in cinema were primarily presented through a male lens, to be appealing to the male gaze and for the purposes of sexualization and objectification. I mean, to a degree, even by today's standards, the love scene in Je Tu Il Elle is still radical, and the way that it's shot has certainly remained unique. The first part of the love scene is almost reminiscent of a wrestling match, and to be honest, when you first watch it, it does feel a bit awkward. However, when you actually analyze what's happening in it, you can see that it contains a lot of writhing, deep breathing, and spasming. And so in that sense, you could perceive it as a kind of interpretive dance about female sexuality. Julie also bites down on her ex-girlfriend here, which connects back to the theme of intertwining nourishment and sexual desire that we discussed earlier. The next part of the love scene shifts to a much slower pace and portrays moments of tenderness and connection between the two women, and I perceive this as an expression of the emotional element and desire for emotional connection in female sexuality. The positioning of the two women also creates creates a symmetry, which conveys an equality between them and in their lovemaking. The final part of the love scene is probably the most intimate and vulnerable out of the three, and the closest to what I would describe as erotic. Yet, even still, the love scene is shot, performed, and directed in a way which doesn't cater to the viewer, and oftentimes the positioning of the women actually shuts out the viewer from observing what's happening emotionally and physically. This scene is about the connection between the two women, it's not about audience gratification. And again, this is one of the aspects that make it so cinematically unique. So in my interpretation, each part of the love scene portrays a different expression of female sexuality, and these three parts together create an overall picture of how complex, layered, aligned, and yet non-linear intimacy between two women can be. And finally, it's also notable that the film ends with Julie leaving her ex-girlfriend sleeping in bed, as it links directly to the opening words of the film "And so I left," connecting the end right back to the beginning and creating a loop. As discussed earlier, the end section also creates context for the first section of the film too. Nice! So, from all of this, my overall interpretation of Je Tu Il Elle is that it is a raw portrayal of the human need for connection and how that intersects with womanhood and sexuality. I also think that the film, through its artistic and technical choices, contains a lot of commentary, either inadvertently or purposefully, on the way women's bodies, thoughts, voices, experiences, and sexuality are commonly portrayed or not portrayed in cinema. So it's a really interesting film to deconstruct. Overall, Je Tu Il Elle is a radical and groundbreaking piece of sapphic cinema that is fascinating from both a feminist and artistic perspective. And whilst not technically a lesbian film, its historical significance to and influence on lesbian cinema cannot be understated. Okay guys, if you've seen Je Tu Il Elle, let me know your thoughts on it down in the comments section below. Don't forget to subscribe for instant disappointment, and to see you guys soon. Bye!